Good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk some more about the maximal data approach to arguing for Jesus' resurrection and the sort of minimal facts approach. It's what you might call an enhanced minimal facts approach or something like that I also disagree with, which I alluded to in the previous video. I want to start by clearing away a misconception, a straw man that you will sometimes hear of the maximal data approach to arguing for the resurrection, which I favor. And this misconception goes like this. If you take a maximalist approach, then you have to reconcile every alleged discrepancy between and among the gospel accounts of the resurrection. You have to reconcile every single one. You have to have satisfactory reconciliation for them all, and terribly burdensome. We don't want to have to do that. That is just wrong. I object to that, and I want to ask anybody who has a tendency to say that, please stop saying that, because just to begin with, it's not true. It should be obvious that it's not true, partly because I myself am not even an inerrantist. So to take one example, in the Gospel of Luke, it says that Jesus first appeared to the male disciples, to the 11 and those who were with them. And then in John, referring to the same appearance, it mentions that Thomas was not with them, and that would be 10 instead of 11. Now, it's possible that the phrase the 11, like the phrase the 12, is a group name, but I'm not wholly convinced of that. And so I'm open to the possibility that Luke had simply not heard that Thomas wasn't with them, and he had heard the disciples were there and assumed that all 11 were there, and that's why he said the 11, which would be a minor good faith error. If you read The Mirror or the Mask, chapter 4, which I strongly urge you to read, you'll see there my discussion of how saying that the authors deliberately embellished, deliberately changed something is far more detrimental to their reliability than saying that they made some minor good faith error is, because we have highly reliable witnesses, and we have an idea of how that works, even if they're fallible. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be doing this by the handful, tons of irreconcilable contradictions, but certainly you don't have to reconcile every single one. But suppose you're an inerrantist, you still can take a maximal data approach without reconciling every single one, because inerrantists have always had discrepancies for which they said, I don't know what the correct reconciliation is there, and that doesn't mean they're punting to theological mystery or something. That's just, in history, there's contingent information that we sometimes don't know. And so the inerrantist, having a high prior probability that this is inerrant, this doesn't contain any errors, says, well, maybe there's just something else out there that we don't know, and so he doesn't have to reconcile every single discrepancy, and he doesn't if he's a maximalist either. If he's, let's say, an evidentialist, an inerrantist making a maximal data case, he can just do the same thing that he would otherwise have done for some of them and just say, maybe it's this, or maybe it's this, or maybe there's something we don't know. So that's just not true. The other reason that I object to that claim is that I believe that really when you hear someone say that, it's not that he's just got a couple. Generally, when a person says, I don't want to have to reconcile every discrepancy, he doesn't want to reconcile many of the alleged discrepancies among the gospel resurrection accounts. Such a person generally just wants to punt to something else. It doesn't matter, even if they're all discrepancies. It's not the core. Maybe they're compositional devices and so forth. And I've got a whole book on that and on the cost of that and the problems with that. But the point is that it's not just one or two. It's usually, God forbid we should have to do any kind of harmonization except the most obvious harmonizations, that you'd have to be crazy not to accept anything that requires any degree of imagination. We don't want that, because then people are going to think we're crazy fundamentalists or something. But actually, as I've argued many times, that's good historical practice, and the vast majority of the alleged discrepancies between the gospel accounts are quite easily reconcilable. I seem to recall I had a really good discussion of this on the White Horse Inn, and I'll see if I can find the link to that and put it in the show notes below. So if you're going around, putting your hand to your forehead and saying, I don't want to be burdened with reconciling all of the contradictions. Well, A, all is a straw man, but B, for the vast majority of them, it's not that hard. I'm going to say, pull up your socks, clean your room, reconcile your contradictions between the gospel accounts of the resurrection. It's not that big of a deal, and it's good historical practice. So that objection, I really don't think should be an objection that we're making. But there, I think, is a further concern about the maximal data approach that's a little bit more subtle. And I think this concern arises from the idea that if you take a maximal approach, you kind of have to do everything at once, or you always have to make your very strongest argument. You can never make an auxiliary argument, which would be like a helpful argument that's maybe not the very strongest, but you could put it in there, kind of add it to the case. You're not supposed to do that. And that also is not a consequence of the maximal data approach. Neither of those, that you can't make auxiliary arguments, nor that you have to do everything somehow all at once. So, for example, if a skeptic alleges a bunch of contradictions, you can say, I am willing to talk about that, and believe me, the skeptic's going to make you get back to that, but I'd like to talk about this other argument for right now. And I actually did this in Hidden in Plain View, and I recommend this as an approach. I didn't concede all the contradictions. I just said, in this book, I'm not going to talk about reconciling contradictions. I'm going to try to put them in perspective by making a positive argument. That was the argument from Undesigned Coincidences for the reliability of the accounts. And that was the Gospels as a whole and Acts. And that puts the alleged contradictions in perspective so that we're not all the time saying, oh, contradictions, got to resolve contradictions. We're on the defensive. We're taking the offensive and saying, look, we've got this huge backdrop of positive evidence for reliability. And that's a way to do it that doesn't involve conceding. And I'm going to recommend that in general. How does this somewhat indirect, intermediate, enhanced minimal facts approach goes? Well, roughly, and here I'm going to try to present this fairly, but then I'm going to talk about some consequences of it that I think may ruffle some feathers and ways in which it actually ends up being quite implausible. But as an initial statement, trying to state this as objectively as possible, it goes approximately like this, or at least the version I object to goes approximately like this. Let's concede that the Gospels in their resurrection accounts are or may very plausibly be embellished. So it's just some kind of core, and sometimes that gets to be a very limited core. Jesus appeared in some fashion to a group of his disciples or something like that. So we try to boil it down, but we concede that beyond that it is or may be embellished. And having conceded that, then we say, but we still think, and we still are going to argue, that the disciples had robust physical experiences that justified them. They were rational in believing that Jesus was physically risen from the dead. Well, how do we do that? And then therefore we are also rational in believing that Jesus was physically risen from the dead. So how do we do that? Well, we pour a lot of energy into arguing that they believed that he was physically risen from the dead. And that's what they taught, that he was physically risen from the dead. That's often done via the Apostle Paul and the fact that he said their gospel was like his gospel. Sometimes we bring in Jewish conceptions of resurrection, as discussed by N.T. Wright, for example, and so that if they're using the term resurrection, they do mean a physical resurrection. And that's important, especially since older liberal scholars would sometimes fixate on Paul's use of the phrase spiritual body to argue that Jesus wasn't physically resurrected. And I think it's good to counteract that's not what he means by spiritual body. Okay, so they believed and taught that he was physically resurrected. I'm telling you, they believed and taught that he was physically resurrected. Did you hear me? They believed and taught that he was physically resurrected. Got it. And then the argument says, well, they wouldn't have believed this if they didn't have good reason for it, and that more limited experiences, brief experiences that didn't seem robustly physical, would not have been sufficient to sustain this firm belief and teaching. So it's this counterfactual proposition. Sometimes that is enhanced by another point from N.T. Wright, which is that they didn't expect this physical resurrection until the apocalypse when everybody was rising from the dead. And so they didn't expect Jesus individually to be physically resurrected at that time. And I think that's legitimate. I think even though Jesus predicted his own resurrection, they were bemused and baffled about that. They don't seem to have been sitting around in a situation of high expectation. Now, I think that this, as an auxiliary, that is a helping argument or an extra argument, it has some force. On the face of it, prima facie, people don't just go around out of the blue believing that someone has physically risen from the dead. And we do have cases where people claim to have had apparition-type experiences of their loved ones. Even if we take it that they're not lying, they don't generally come to believe that the loved one is physically risen from the dead. So we can argue from that inductively and so forth that it seems a better explanation of the firmness of their belief that that they actually had more robust experiences. I'm not saying that has no force, but I don't think it can sustain a strong argument for the resurrection and what we would call a high posterior probability. And you need a high posterior probability. This is a miracle we're talking about, and it's a life-committing thing. You're gonna be asking people to commit their lives to Jesus, and I think probability doesn't depend on what you have to commit, but whether you're willing to commit or not should depend on probability. And it's legitimate to require a high probability, posterior probability for something before you're going to risk everything for it. So it's not a forceless argument, but it's not going to carry the weight of it all by itself. But by saying that it's not a forceless argument, I mean when we're not making some hugely damaging concession, it's not a forceless argument. It can add to a cumulative case that includes a strong forward position on the reliability of the Gospels. But we greatly sap any force that it has when we do make that damaging concession that I mentioned at the beginning, namely that these are embellished. Once you do that, then you try to come over here and say, oh, but really, probably they did have really robust physical experiences. You're putting your concession right up against the argument you eventually want to make. I refer to this as the hokey pokey approach because we're taking the evidence in and then we're taking the evidence out, putting the evidence in. So take the evidence out by saying it was embellished, and we try to put the evidence back in to say that they really did have experiences like that. So it's the hokey pokey method. Now I'm going to go into something that may ruffle some feathers, but I think it needs to be done, and it's not often done. Let's think about what this hokey pokey approach would look like if they really were embellished in terms of the process of composition of the Gospels. Let's take Luke for an example. So Luke says that Jesus said, touch me and see that I am not a spirit, because spirits don't have flesh and bones as you see me have. And he says, well, do you have any food? And they have honeycomb and fish, and he eats it. And he's sort of proving this to them, right? If we're going to concede that the gospel accounts are embellished, that is precisely the kind of place where they would be considered to be embellished. That's where the liberal scholars are going to say they're embellished. That's where Dale Allison is going to say they're embellished. I even saw one Christian apologist. He was talking about the approach of Dr. Michael Licona. I want to emphasize it's not something that Dr. Licona said himself, so I'm not saddling him with it directly, but I think what this person said was plausible, and he wasn't necessarily rejecting it either. He said if there were these compositional devices in the resurrection accounts, maybe the eating fish in the Gospel of Luke, maybe that would be one of them. And he said this to a skeptic, by the way. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe it would be, but doesn't that really weaken our account? So it's precisely these physical details that are evidence, if they're what the witnesses really claim, they're evidence for a physical resurrection. But if they're embellishments, then they're not evidence for a physical resurrection. We're taking the argument, we're taking the evidence out of the argument. So what does that mean? So we imagine Luke for whatever reason, he doesn't put into his account the real physical experiences that the disciples had. Because remember, in this hokey pokey method, we're saying, no, they really did. They had physical experiences that made them very rational to believe that. Well, then why didn't he put the real ones in there? So for some reason, he's not putting the real ones in there. Instead, he's saying, well, they teach and they believe that he was physically resurrected. So I'm going to put physical stuff in there. But it's not real physical stuff. Or maybe his informants did that. Maybe he copied down what his informants told him, but because he wasn't an apostle himself, maybe some of the people who had talked to the disciples, they didn't have what the real physical appearances were like. And so they made up and embellished some details, and they gave them to Luke. And he put it in there, but it wasn't real. It wasn't what they really experienced. It was an embellishment. But then, by good fortune, and because they're both based on the idea of physicality, what they really experienced was really quite a bit like that. It just wasn't that. Not the details you see, the other details that you don't see. And the same way for John. John says that Jesus invited Thomas to touch his wounds and put his hand in his side. Well, that, is prime candidate for embellishment if we're going to grant embellishment. So John put in something embellished, but he really had a very robust, very convincing physical experiences of the resurrected Jesus, he and the other disciples, but then why didn't he put those in there? So when we look at this in detail and what that would mean for the process of composition, I'm afraid it does look rather silly. And I'm sorry, because a lot of times when I point that out, I'm said to have bad tone, or someone will say that's unfair, or that's a straw man. I'm not saying that those who advocate this say that. I think they haven't thought through those implications. They just want to do this little jiu-jitsu move, this little double move. Let's concede that, but then let's try to get it anyway by this indirect argument. Isn't that great? Now we don't have to defend the robust reliability of the Gospels. Phew! And they're not really thinking about what that would amount to. And I think the problem there arises from this fact. The skeptic would actually be within his rights once you've made that concession to say, well, you know what? You're trying to tell me that they didn't believe irrationally, that they probably had these robust physical experiences, or else they wouldn't have believed it, because that would have been irrational. But if you're also telling me that it was embellished, or you're conceding that it was embellished, then it looks like they did believe irrationally. It looks like they didn't have those robust physical experiences. That's why they weren't available. Real accounts, what they really said about robust physical experiences, that was not available to put in the account. So the gap had to be filled in. And that's what the embellishments are there. They're to fill in the gap, because they didn't really have those robust experiences. So say what you will, it looks like they did believe irrationally, and people do believe irrationally. The skeptic's certainly not going to grant you that the disciples were rational. But I think once you concede that the accounts are embellished, you've handed him a really big tool for denying that their belief was rational. Because if their belief was rational, why are the accounts embellished? So you have come in there and you've undermined the very argument that you want ultimately to make about their rationality and the robust nature of their experiences, but you wanted to make it indirectly, and you've undermined the most obvious way to find out what their experiences were like, which is by reading the Gospels and what they claimed their experiences were like. You've undermined that because you don't want to have to defend the Gospels, so you've conceded that they're embellished. I think this arises from the fact that issues of dependence and independence are very tricky. They're very tricky. An auxiliary argument can add force to a cumulative case, but it does not follow from that the auxiliary argument is so completely independent that we can make a gigantic concession about a different line of argument and have it not impact the auxiliary argument. Here would be a related instance. Suppose that we say, as Dr. William Lane Craig unfortunately has said, I will concede for the sake of the argument all that the skeptic wants to say about contradictions in the Gospels, and yet I'm still going to insist that these propositions are secure because they're the core and so forth. That's a boatload of contradictions that you're conceding. Skeptics will allege a lot of contradictions. If you really want to grant all of those, because at that point, I'm going to say you have so gravely undermined, if the Gospels really have all those contradictions, you have so gravely undermined the reliability of the Gospels that I think you're going to have great difficulty establishing by these indirect means and the criteria of attestation and so forth, the credibility of those facts that you want. Or here would be another example. Suppose that someone says, I'm going to grant for the sake of the argument that the Gospels were written late, really late, that they were not written by their traditional authors, that they were written by people at multiple removes from the facts. But then I'm going to argue, maybe even from some arguments that I use and that I like, that from undesigned coincidences or external confirmations, that they're really, really reliable anyway, and that we should accept their statements. Now, that's an interesting one because I'm all in favor of making arguments, internal arguments and external incidental arguments. But I don't think you should grant that they were written really late and by completely different people and so forth who were at many removes, because that tends to break up the documents. That makes it harder to take them as a whole because the final author then ends up being more like a compiler. That makes it harder to justify them as wholes, because instead of being like a loaf of bread that's all come from one bakery at one time, they're like a loaf of bread that's had several slices put in from different bakeries at different times. So, the induction doesn't work quite as smoothly and so forth. So those are entangled. Even though you don't have to make a big, robust argument right at the outset for the patristic attributions of authorship, even though the arguments from these indirect confirmations have enormous force in their own, part of what they have enormous force for is that they were not written at many removes, that they were written by people close to the facts, which indirectly supports the traditional authorship. So don't go granting that the traditional authorship is false and expect that to have no impact on the conclusion that you want to derive in a different fashion. You have to be careful about this. The fact that something can contribute independently to a cumulative case does not mean that it can survive with its force unshaken if you make an enormous concession on some other part of that cumulative case. So suppose that you do want to make arguments at different times. That's fine. What I'm suggesting you use are phrases like, I'm going to discuss that issue later, or here's something that I think you should consider on its merits, okay? Or if we consider this evidence here, it can place that question in perspective. It can put a new light on that question. That's actually admitting the dependence, but it's just choosing to focus on this argument first. Or here's an argument that I think has some force, even if we don't get into the pros and cons on that issue right now. You see, these kinds of ways of speaking, they're not concessionary, and therefore they don't undermine where you ultimately want to go. So I hope all of this can clear away some misconceptions about the maximal data approach and can encourage you in accepting that approach and taking that approach, that it does not saddle you with things that you shouldn't be saddled with. It just saddles you with the things you should be saddled with, and that indeed you're going to need in the end anyway in order to have a truly robust case for Christianity. We should regard this as a privilege. It is our privilege to bring forward this strong case rather than a burden. And that's what I want to advertise to people and bring across to people as we continue to make common sense rigorous. Thanks for watching.